Inflation, the general rise in prices over time, is a challenge faced by economies across the world. When inflation becomes too high, it eats away at the purchasing power of people's savings, hurts those on fixed incomes, and can destabilize economies. It's a complex phenomenon, influenced by global forces, supply and demand, and public expectations. As inflation rises, governments and central banks must act decisively to bring it back under control. Let's explore the various ways a country typically fights inflation, focusing on the major strategies, their rationale, and how these tools are used in practice. One of the most important and direct tools in combating inflation is through monetary policy, which refers to the actions taken by a nation's central bank. Central banks, such as the Federal Reserve in the United States, the European Central Bank in the Eurozone, or the Bank of England in the United Kingdom, are tasked with maintaining price stability or keeping inflation under control. Their main lever is the policy interest rate, which influences how much it costs for banks, businesses, and consumers to borrow money. When inflation heats up, central banks typically respond by raising interest rates. By increasing the cost of borrowing, they hope to slow down the rate at which money circulates through the economy. Higher interest rates mean people are less likely to take out loans to buy homes or cars, and businesses may postpone investments in new factories or equipment. As demand cools off, upward pressure on prices eases. At the same time, higher interest rates often make saving money in the bank more attractive, which further reduces spending. Central banks also have other tools at their disposal to reduce the money supply and thus dampen inflation. One such method is open market operations, selling government bonds. When the central bank sells bonds, buyers exchange cash for these securities, effectively removing money from circulation and decreasing the cash available in the financial system. With less money swirling around, there's less fuel to drive up prices. In addition, central banks can raise the reserve requirements for commercial banks. These requirements dictate how much money banks must keep in reserve rather than lend out. When reserve requirements go up, banks can't extend as many loans, which further limits the expansion of credit and spending in the economy. While monetary policy is often the first line of defense against rising inflation, governments also have a suite of tools at their disposal through fiscal policy, decisions about taxation and government spending. When inflation threatens to get out of hand, governments may choose to pare back their own expenditures. By cutting government spending, the government itself buys fewer goods and services, reducing overall demand in the economy. Lower demand means less competition for resources, which can help slow down price increases. Another approach is to increase taxes. By raising income taxes, sales taxes, or other forms of taxation, the government takes more money out of households' pockets. With less disposable income, consumers typically spend less on goods and services, further cooling demand and easing price pressures. Governments often weigh these actions carefully, as both spending cuts and tax hikes can be unpopular and may slow economic growth or affect vulnerable populations. Sometimes, inflation is caused less by too much demand and more by problems on the supply side of the economy. This is known as cost-push inflation, where rising costs of production feed directly into higher prices for consumers. Supply shocks, such as a sudden spike in energy prices, disruptions to key global supply chains, or natural disasters, can push the cost of making goods and delivering services sharply higher. To address supply-side inflation, governments and central banks look beyond simply controlling demand. Instead, they seek to make it easier, faster, and cheaper for businesses to produce goods and services. This can involve improving infrastructure, such as roads, ports, and technology networks, to help move products more efficiently. Streamlining regulations, lowering taxes on producers, or investing in training and education to make the workforce more productive can also be part of the solution. While such measures often take longer to show results, they build long-term strength in the economy, raising productivity so that more goods and services can be provided without driving up prices. Inflation is also affected by a country's currency and its value in international markets. If the national currency strengthens, meaning it can buy more of other currencies, imported goods become cheaper. This can help reduce inflation, especially in countries that rely heavily on imports for essentials like energy, food, or raw materials. Governments and central banks may intervene in currency markets, buying or selling their own currency to influence its value. However, these interventions come with risks and trade-offs. A stronger currency can hurt exporters by making their goods more expensive abroad, and heavy-handed interventions can create market instability if not managed carefully. Historically, some governments have used wage and price controls to put a direct lid on inflation. By freezing wages or capping prices on basic goods and services, they try to stop inflation from spiraling out of control in the short term. Yet, this approach is rarely used today, as it often leads to unintended consequences, such as shortages, black markets, and a decline in quality. Businesses may stop supplying goods they're forced to sell at artificially low prices, and workers may leave jobs if wages cannot keep up with the cost of living. No anti-inflation strategy exists in a vacuum. The effectiveness of each tool depends on the causes of inflation, the structure of the economy, and the broader global environment. For example, raising interest rates may not be effective if inflation is driven mainly by supply issues beyond a central bank's control, such as a sudden shortage in oil. Nor will cutting government spending help if inflation comes from imported goods whose prices are rising. Take, for instance, how the United States typically fights inflation. When inflation begins to rise, attention turns first to the Federal Reserve. The Fed reviews economic data, paying particular attention to signals like unemployment, consumer spending, and price indexes. If inflationary pressures are rooted in strong consumer demand or easy credit, the Fed is likely to begin raising interest rates. These adjustments are often incremental, and the Fed must strike a balance, working to slow inflation without tipping the economy into recession. If rising prices are also being aggravated by government spending, such as during periods of heavy economic stimulus, the federal government may look for ways to reduce the fiscal footprint. This could mean cutting back on new infrastructure projects, delaying planned expansions, or letting temporary spending programs expire. Fiscal restraint works alongside monetary policy to cool excess demand. In cases where inflation is being driven by external supply shocks, like surging global energy prices or shortages in manufacturing inputs, both monetary and fiscal policies might need to be supplemented with targeted measures. Governments might act to boost energy supply, help resolve shipping logjams, or work to increase the availability of critical resources. These interventions often involve coordination with industry, targeted investments, or temporary regulatory waivers to speed up production. Central to all successful anti-inflation measures is the importance of public expectations. If consumers and businesses believe inflation will remain high, they may demand higher wages and set higher prices, which in turn can make inflation self-perpetuating. Maintaining credibility is crucial. Central banks and governments must communicate their intentions clearly and stick to their stated goals, reassuring markets and the public that inflation will indeed be brought under control. Throughout all these efforts, trade-offs and risks must be carefully managed. Raising interest rates too quickly or by too much can choke off economic growth, causing higher unemployment and even triggering recession. Cutting government spending or raising taxes can disrupt important public services or investment in areas like education and health. Supply-side reforms usually take time to yield benefits and may face political resistance. In today's interconnected world, no economy operates in isolation. Inflationary pressures can spill across borders, particularly in globalized industries or commodity markets. Coordination between countries, sharing information, and sometimes even harmonizing policy moves can strengthen the collective fight against inflation. The history of inflation fighting has taught important lessons. In the 1970s, many advanced economies faced a period of stagflation, a troubling mix of high inflation and sluggish growth, driven largely by oil price shocks. Traditional tools like interest rate hikes were not always effective, and it took strong leadership and bold policy moves to finally bring inflation under control. Since then, central banks have become more independent, focusing closely on price stability as their primary policy goal and acting quickly when inflation threatens to rise. The challenge for today's policymakers is to balance the often competing goals of growth, employment, and price stability. Each time inflation picks up, the toolkit must be brought out, the right measures chosen, and the path forward navigated with skill and care. In summary, fighting inflation is a multifaceted task, relying first on central banks to raise interest rates and control the money supply, supported by government action to manage spending and taxes. Supply-side improvements build long-term resilience, while currency, and rarely, direct controls, can provide short-term relief when needed. Success depends not only on the right tools, but also on public confidence, timely execution, and an understanding of the deeper causes behind each inflationary wave. Through these combined efforts, economies work steadily to protect the value of money, ensuring stability for businesses and families alike.